The smell of Egypt was mud and wheat and river water, the Nile cutting its ancient path through a land so old it seemed to have existed before memory itself. Along its banks, the black soil bloomed every season with abundance, and the great stone monuments of Pharaoh stood against the horizon like declarations that some men were gods and others were not. The Israelites were not. For 400 years, for centuries of sunrises and sunsets, of children born into chains and grandparents buried without dignity, the descendants of Abraham had worked the baked Egyptian earth. Their hands knew the weight of straw and clay. Their shoulders knew the particular ache of carrying stone. They built the store cities of Pithom and Ramesses. They made Egypt magnificent and beautiful, and they were not thanked for it. They were watched. They were counted. They were whipped when they slowed. But they remembered. In hushed voices over fires too small to warm a whole family, the elders spoke of a God who had made a promise to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, a promise about a land, about a future, about belonging somewhere under heaven with dignity. The question that lived in the marrow of every Israelite bone was this: had God forgotten? Or was he somewhere watching, waiting, keeping account of every tear and every cry in a way that Pharaoh's taskmasters never could? Moses knew that question. He had lived inside it. He had been born an Israelite and raised as a prince of Egypt. He had killed a man for striking a slave and then fled into the desert like a man without a country, because that was exactly what he was. He had married in Midian. He had kept sheep. He had heard the voice of God in a burning bush that would not be consumed. And then, reluctantly, with every objection a frightened man could offer, "I cannot speak well. They will not listen. Please send someone else." He had turned back toward Egypt. Now he stood in the middle of the 10th night, the final night, the one that would answer the question at last. God had spoken 9 plagues into Egypt's proud face. The Nile had run red as blood. The frogs had come in their overwhelming, absurd thousands. Gnats, flies, livestock disease, boils that rose on skin like accusations. Each one aimed not merely at Pharaoh's comfort, but at the gods of Egypt themselves. Ra, the sun god, had been mocked by darkness so thick a man could feel it pressing against his skin. Happy, the god of the Nile, had seen his river turn to ruin. Each plague was a theological statement, a divine answer to Pharaoh's contemptuous question, "Who is the Lord, that I should obey his voice?" Here is who. Here is who. And yet Pharaoh had hardened. He had released the Israelites and then called them back. He had bargained and retreated and bargained again. He had a nation's pride to protect, a monument to his own power that could not be allowed to simply walk away into the wilderness singing freedom songs. So one final thing had been announced. One final, terrible, irreversible thing. Moses had gathered the elders of Israel and spoken God's instructions with an urgency that filled the rooms where they met. His voice did not shake, but his eyes said everything words could not. Each family was to take a lamb, a year-old male, without defect, and keep it for 4 days. On the 14th day of the month, at twilight, they were to slaughter it. They were to take its blood and paint it on the 2 doorposts and on the lintel above their front door, using a branch of hyssop, that small scraggly plant that grew in the cracks of walls. And then they were to roast the lamb whole and eat it quickly, sandals on their feet, staff in hand, dressed for departure, with bitter herbs and unleavened bread, because there was no time for bread to rise. The meal had a name God gave it, Passover, Pesach, because the destroyer would move through Egypt that night, and wherever the blood was painted on the doorframe, he would pass over that house. The firstborn of every home that bore no blood would die. Moses told them all of this. He told them without the softening that fear might have wanted. And the people of Israel bowed their heads and worshipped. Then they went and did exactly as the Lord had commanded. Think about what that looked like. Thousands of families, in the thin slant of late afternoon light, selecting their lambs. Children who had named the lambs watching with the particular grief of children who understand something terrible is necessary but cannot quite hold it without hurting. The smell of blood on wood. The sound of hyssop brushing against doorposts. Mothers pulling children inside. Doors closing. Fires lit. The smell of roasting meat rising through the tight streets of Goshen, that particular quarter of Egypt where Israel had been settled and confined, rising against a sky that was going dark, going darker than it should. And then the silence. That silence is almost impossible to describe. A whole people seated on the floor of their homes, dressed as though they were about to leave, because they were, eating in a hush so heavy it was almost a sound of its own. Children kept close to parents, fathers with their staves across their laps, mothers pressing bread into the hands of the young ones and not letting go of those hands immediately after. Outside, the night deepened. And then, at midnight, the Lord passed through Egypt. It is written simply in the book of Exodus. There was not a house where there was not one dead. From Pharaoh's palace, where the firstborn prince lay suddenly, irreversibly still, to the house of the prisoner in the dungeon, grief tore through Egypt like a wind. The sound that rose was unlike anything a living person had heard before or would hear again, a cry that belonged to every street, every family, every household simultaneously. Egypt mourned with one voice. But in Goshen, in the homes with the painted doorposts, there was life. Heartbeats. The sound of a child asking a question and a parent answering. The faint smell of roasted lamb and bitter herbs and the particular sweetness of freedom beginning to take shape in the lungs. Pharaoh sent for Moses before the night was out. The most powerful man on earth, shattered by grief, in the dark, said, "Go. Take your flocks and your herds. Take everything. And bless me also." That last request, "Bless me also," is one of the most quietly devastating lines in all of Scripture. Here was the man who had refused to let Israel pray to their God in the wilderness, now asking that same God for a blessing. That is what midnight and loss and the absence of pride will do to a man. In the pre-dawn dark, 600,000 men and women and children and cattle and the mixed multitude who chose to leave with them walked out of Egypt. They carried the unleavened dough on their shoulders, not yet baked. They carried gold and silver and clothing pressed upon them by their Egyptian neighbors. And they carried something invisible, something that would become more precious than any of it. The memory of what God had done and the knowledge that he had kept his word. Moses would one day stand on a mountain and receive the law. The waters of the Red Sea would part. Manna would fall like grace from a morning sky. But every one of those things would root itself in this. In a night when a people chose to believe a promise they could not yet see, painted blood on their doorframes in the dark, and waited. What this story tells us is not simply that God rescues people who cry out to him, though he does. What it shows us is something quieter and more costly. It shows us that faith always asks for an act before it offers the sight. It asked Israel to paint the blood before the night came. It asked them to put on their sandals before the door opened. It asked them to be ready for a freedom they had not yet touched. The Passover was never only about Egypt. It was about every night in human history when someone has sat in the dark, in their coat, staff in hand, waiting, trusting that dawn was coming because the one who promised it does not forget. And just before sunrise, they walked through the open gate of everything that had held them, and the night behind them turned to morning.